Good morning, everybody. I know we're expecting more people, but I think we're going to begin so that our speakers have an opportunity to engage with you fully. My name is Artemis Kurt, University Librarian, and I am very happy to say that the scholarly communications team, particularly Mark Neuheusler and Bill Olson, led this program today, and all I have to do is have the honor of welcoming you and introducing you to our speakers. First, however, I would like to thank the members of the Scholarly Communications Committee, which is a university-wide organization. These people include Richard Brown from the Georgetown Press, and a bunch of other folks who are Morgan Stoddard, Stephanie Clark, Carol Sargent, Bill Olson, Marjorie Blumenthal, Kumar Jayasuriya, Roger Skalbeck, and Mark Neuheusler. So please join me in thanking these people for the work that they put into this program. Our moderator and guest of honor is Neeru Paharia, who is from the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. She's a graduate of the Harvard Business School, where she obtained a doctorate in business administration. She continued to work at Harvard as research director at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics before joining the McDonough School of Business in the fall of this year. Prior to her career in academia, Neeru was an associate consultant at McKinsey & Company, the executive director of Creative Commons, and has co-founded a number of different community-oriented social media projects, such as ccmixter.org, a social music remixing website, acawiki.org, Wikipedia for academics, and p2pu.org, peer-based online learning. Thank you for being our moderator and guest of honor, Neeru. In addition, we have, representing the Georgetown Office of Communications social media group, Rachel Pugh. She is a frontliner for Georgetown's communications with the world. She fields questions on a huge variety of issues, including stolen clock hands, controversial speakers, and complaints from neighbors, of which I'm sure there are only a few. She is also part of the Georgetown social media group, which develops policies and best practices for media use at Georgetown. Richard Price, who is the CEO of Academia.edu. He graduated with a DPhil in philosophy from Oxford University, across the pond, where he was a prize fellow at All Souls College. His doctoral research was on the philosophy of perception and, in particular, on how to draw the line between visible and non-visible properties. Parallel to his doctoral research, he worked on founding a few startups, including a Facebook app. He launched Academia.edu in 2008 as a platform where academics can share their research, monitor deep analytics around the impact of their research, and track the research of academics that they follow. According to the website, 1 million, nearly 800,000 academics have signed up to Academia.edu, adding another 1.5 million papers and over 500,000 research interests. Academia.edu attracts over almost 4 million unique visitors a month. Impressive. And David Rebus of Georgetown University. He holds a PhD in sociology and science studies from the University of California, San Diego, and did a postdoc at the University of Michigan School of Information. He's been a faculty member in Georgetown University's Communications, Culture, and Technology program since 2008. His research focuses on the socio-technical facets of cyber infrastructure, for example, networked information technologies for the support of science, and how it is transforming the practice and organization of contemporary knowledge production. As principal investigator on National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health grants, he currently studies the consequences of novel information technologies on the activities of scientists and users, and exploring new patterns of distributed collaboration. I should also add he is a member of the Georgetown University Faculty Library Advisory Committee, the acronym for which is FLAG. But he doesn't give us. Welcome, David. Thank you all once again for coming. Thank you to the Scholarly Communications team once again. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Neeru.
I won't say too much before our presenters will be discussing the potential of technology to inspire research, to disseminate research, to create broader collaborations between researchers. But one of the most exciting things about technology has been the ability to connect people who weren't already connected. And when I was at Creative Commons about 10 years ago now, One of the things that we drew inspiration from was that all ideas no idea is original. Every idea is based off of pieces from other people's ideas, other people's learning. So to think that we're in isolation coming up with our own ideas and promoting grandeur is just false. And it's true in academia more so than in any other place, where all our work is obviously derived from so many other scholars who can come before us. We cite them, we talk about our work in the context of other people's work. So academia is really a natural place where collaboration is key, and therefore technology is really essential. So one point is how technology can actually improve relations between scholars to increase the velocity of learning and research. And I think the other key aspect to really think about when we think about social media is how it can be used to break down the walls of the ivory tower. And so all our research gets published in these peer-reviewed journals. Often they're protected by really heavy copyright, and you can't actually access these works unless you have a subscription through a library or something like that. But that really limits the potential of research to actually get out into the world. So there's so many people who could actually benefit from the research that academics do in business, in government, in social life, and yet there's a huge barrier to that, both in terms of access and in terms of language and translation. So a lot of academic work is also kind of protected by the jargon that we use. And so a couple points just to put out there in terms of the potential of technology and social media to really open things up, to break down the walls of the ivory tower, and to also just increase interactions between academics. And our speakers today all have been doing really interesting things, developing social media websites, studying social media, and actually participating in this world on behalf of the university. So I hope all these perspectives will provide us some groundwork to, after the presentations, to kind of think about how to integrate all these different aspects together and see how we can move the thinking forward. So with that, I'll just go in order as we have here. So Rachel, Director of Media Communications at Georgetown.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone's doing well this morning. So I'm the Director of Media Relations at Georgetown, and our Office of Communications has a few other folks. My colleague Rob Mathis, who couldn't be here today, actually manages a lot of our social media, but we do Twitter and Facebook every day, 24/7, for the university. And I'll talk a little bit about what we do in practice and then our work to collaborate across the university as more and more units, the library, athletics, each academic program tries to get online and share their work as well. Again, a little bit of what I'll talk about today, why social media is so important to Georgetown and the different communities we're trying to engage. So, social media is a really powerful medium for the university community to collectively tell our story. We do it in a valuable and authentic way. A lot of our posts are going directly to what we're putting on the university site, which is...
Is there a hashtag for today?
I don't have one, Mark. No. We do this by inspiring everyone at the university to use social communication and collaboration tools in a creative, strategic, and professional manner. That's part of what the social media working group is doing to get everyone to act with integrity on behalf of the university, because now we have all these individual spokespeople for everything that's happening every day. And we try to meet our community where they are online. So our prospective students might be on Facebook, and some of the media and global thought leaders that we're trying to attract maybe are using Twitter more. And so we try to balance all of that and how we talk to people on both of those platforms. This is a word cloud from earlier this week, but you can kind of get an idea of the types of conversations that are happening about the university. Certainly the US elections are a very big topic. Our faculty are out there every day talking about different aspects of that, and we also have a lot of students applying early action this next week. So you get some of those ideas from those words. You'll also see kind of what I've been at Georgetown 5 years, and we were not on Twitter and Facebook really when I started in 2007. But since October 2010, we've increased our Facebook fans by 150%. Twitter followers have grown even faster. So our strategy for some of these principles are just to continually develop and provide ways for members of our community to connect with one another in the university, to create a dialogue that allows the community to share and engage with our message. So I think as you see more followers, more of them have found information that they can use and that they can share with others as well. And working even more to collaborate with other departments, people, and organizations. You'll see a lot of our events. And we'll work with the news organizations that are there, or the State Department has hosted some really great conferences on campus, and we'll share a hashtag with them and a live video webcast. And you'll see people from all over the world commenting on Facebook where the website, where the webcast is posted, and they're having a very complicated conversation about, for example, the head of state of Argentina when she was speaking here a few months ago. And so it's a great opportunity for Georgetown as a global university to really engage with people all over. Another piece is just to create and maintain authentic Georgetown voice. So we try to on Facebook keep it a little bit more formal than maybe your personal Facebook post would be, because we're acting as an institution, a very prestigious institution.
No pictures of Jack stripping?
No. Yeah, and we try to be really authentic about who we are as a university, so that it doesn't sound like one of our students is tweeting. You'll see very different things coming from our student media and other individuals, or certainly the Jack Bolt account can be a little bit more silly than our actual @Georgetown Twitter handle. And then the third piece that's most important, and all of us are here, is to educate. As one of the leading academic and research institutions, we want to share that information. Sometimes if we just posted a story on our website or just put it in our newsletter, which is all we had when I got here a few years ago, it's a very internal community, and we're talking to each other, but there's so many other folks that we want to be in touch with to share information and engage around the world. So part of the challenge for all of us as we're online is picking the right platform. We're focused really on 5 primary pieces, and I said every day we're on Facebook and Twitter, but we put a lot of video with faculty, lectures that happen on campus, onto YouTube. We use Flickr to share a lot of photos that other units can there. I see Josh Spicer's nodding because we share these photos on our different pieces. And then Foursquare, it's out there. You can check in all over campus and take a tour and find fun facts, but not the bulk of our work. So as I mentioned, Facebook, we're posting every day. I think this morning we're announcing a $20 million gift for an environment initiative that will include 3 new faculty alliance and a lot of cross-collaboration that's really tying the university's strategic goals for academics and research and with our philanthropy as well. So it's a really interesting story if you have a chance to look at that. On Facebook, we're seeing students, alumni, our GU community about campus news and updates, also parents. During Hurricane Sandy just this week, we were posting our closures online and letting people know where there was more resources about how to prepare in case we had a shutdown, which did happen for about 15 hours where we didn't have McDonough halls open. And, that helped get the information out, and people were really reassured. So it's a very practical purpose as well. Facebook, you'll see a lot of the visual storytelling of what's happening on campus. So we kind of think of our content as food, and there's broccoli and cake, and we try to balance that out. But there's enough cake that people want to consume the broccoli, so that when we have our really serious pieces of research, they're still engaged. They're still clicking like on a picture of snow around Healy Circle. John Carroll's very popular, but we're getting a lot of engagement on the real research, the bulk of what's happening here on campus every day. On Twitter, it's a little bit more laid back and conversational, partly by the character limit that we have to be more concise. And so we think differently about how we share that content. If we put something on Facebook, we'll share it differently on Twitter. Again, our office is always trying to drive people to the website for more information about the research that's going on. All of our stories link to related research stories to try to get people engaged in what's happening at Georgetown, no matter who they are. We also send out information about the high-level events, kind of the conversations that are happening on campus when we're webcasting a lecture live. Talked a little bit about Flickr, that we share these photos in collaboration. We've also kind of explored in the last year Pinterest and Tumblr around commencement through the social media working group. We worked with all of the different schools for students and faculty to upload photos about what they were doing during this weekend. As everyone knows, at Georgetown, we have many, many different celebrations around graduation. And that's kind of unique about Georgetown. I'll let them tell that in their own words rather than my office pushing our opinion about graduation. So the fun part, in the last year we've started this social media working group. As more and more units and individuals are online, I think people are looking for some guidance about how to help share the stories, but also how to protect themselves from doing something wrong if there's no rules here on campus. So this group has people from athletics, from the library, from all the academic units, and a couple of student programs. And we've really been talking about how we use social media, how other universities are using it, how different companies are using it best, and what makes sense at Georgetown. And we're working on some guidelines to share to help people use it most effectively and strategically so that they're not expending so much energy to put something out and not having people read it. But it also has created this great collaboration where we share content and we know something's coming, and so we're people are more aware of the different accounts that are all over campus. So we've seen a lot more activity across everyone's accounts since starting that. A few of the successes of these examples of collaboration. We got a new bulldog puppy last April and had a nice hashtag campaign going. I think this was great for prospective students, people far away, dog lovers in general. It's just kind of a school spirit thing, but certainly not highlighted in our most academic pieces. We also, if you watch the campaign conventions this fall, a lot of people began using this visual storytelling much more actively, and so we've started doing this as well because it's just something that's easier to share on Facebook. So President DeGioia was featured as a brave thinker in The Atlantic this month, and we put a little post about that, highlighting his comments on the university and free speech and how important that dialogue is here. And we had over 700 likes in less than a day, which is really big for us. And something that he wasn't comfortable sharing on his own Facebook page. He was a bit too modest about it, but we thought there were a lot of people in our community that would like that and like to think about all that's happened at the university in the last year and under his leadership. So we shared that. He's on Facebook. The provost is on Twitter. And our dean of the business school is on Twitter as well. So we have a few academic leaders out there, and then certainly every program is. We've done a survey, and there's over 300 accounts for Georgetown. So part of the social media working group is trying to think about who all these different people are, how they're using social media, and what kind of tools they need to more effectively share the work that's happening in their unit with other people at Georgetown and outside with their prospective students and the faculty they're recruiting and people they want to share information with. Here's all of our handles that I just talked about. If you want to follow any of them, I can send them to you later as well. A big piece of my work is also crisis communications, and so we respond to local media. DC Fire and EMS during the Hurricane Irene said that our roof was collapsing, and so a lot, which it wasn't. There was under construction, a piece of roof was blowing around, and we just needed some help securing it in the middle of the night. But my job was to get on Twitter and Facebook and say, no, actually, it's just a piece of roof, and we're tying it down. Everything's under control, to reassure people. So the big piece of it is just understanding how to correct misinformation out there, that it's not always pushing this. polling as well. Happy to answer any questions later about this. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Rachel. And next we have, we'll save questions to the end. Next we have Richard Price from Academia.edu talking about his experience with the social networking.
Okay, cool. Good to go. All right, so, well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. The background of Academia.edu is that I did a PhD in Oxford in philosophy and stayed there. I did my undergrad, started my undergrad in 1998. Eventually left Oxford in around 2007. I did my master's there as well. And I had a kind of entrepreneurial interest and streak running through my veins. And did a number of ventures on the side of my PhD. When I finished the PhD, or in Oxford they call them DPhils, I had the idea for Academia.edu. I saw what I perceived to be an extraordinarily inefficient academic publishing system that is sort of reminiscent of tools that were developed in the 17th century. And I saw the dynamism of the web and how people were using the web to accelerate and make the world a smaller place. So I thought basically these tools should be brought to the world of science, the world of academia. And I decided to build a platform that solved that problem. So that is Academia.edu. I mean, I guess one final thing is, having had that idea and made that decision, I decided to move to Silicon Valley. So I was enamored by the technology opportunities out there. I raised some venture capital in London, about $600,000. And actually it was very difficult transitioning from the ultimate ivory tower. I was actually a fellow of All Souls College, which I think is where the term ivory tower originated. It's kind of the ultimate in that regard. And transitioning into the commercial world, it took a while to build a new network. I initially had a network of philosophers of mind, and had to develop a network of venture capitalists, and I talked that language. But anyway, I raised that money and moved to Silicon Valley, and since then we've actually raised a few more rounds. We raised about $7 million, and we have a 12-person team, very engineering-focused team. So in this talk I'm going to describe that academia a little bit and how the site works, and what our various uses are, and then I'm going to talk about our goals for the future of research. So the site has about 1.8 million, 1.9 million users at the moment. And about 4,500 academics join each day. It's growing fast. Last year we were adding about 500 users a day, so it's definitely kind of following that pattern you see on a lot of social media platforms, which is growth becomes a function of scale. And the bigger the scale, the more users you have telling their friends about the site, and just grows exponentially in that way. So there are three main parts of the website, three main reasons you might want to have a profile, might want to sign up and use it. First, you'll create a profile, so Stephen Baker has a profile on the site. And the main reason you want a profile is that more and more these days people are finding research on the web. That is the primary way in which research papers and researchers themselves are discovered. And it's just critical to have a really good place right up the top of Google, ideally number one, for your name, and to really own that and have a page that celebrates your research. So our design philosophy and our thinking around this page profile is to build a page that really celebrates someone's research. I think the more general trend that you're seeing on the web at the moment, and these profile pages are part of that trend, is that you're seeing individual people wanting to engage directly with their audience. In the old days, there used to be these media outlets, these publishers, which would mediate the relationship between the content creator and the consumer and the audience. And in the academic world, what that means is that the journal would mediate the relationship between an academic and their audience. And what you're seeing now, I believe, on the broader web and also in the academic context, is a situation where content creators, such as academics, want direct relationships with their audience. They want to know how many views they have themselves. They want to nurture that audience and build themselves. And we saw in the last presentation, how many followers you have as a content creator is actually quite a gratifying metric. It shows how you're doing. and you want those sorts of, you want to nurture those kinds of relationships. So the profile is all about displaying your research. We have stats at the top right, showing profile views, document views, follow accounts, and so on, that give someone browsing these profiles a sense of, okay, how popular is this profile, and so on. What are the web metrics around this profile? So talking about metrics, I'm going to talk about, this is actually going to be a continuing theme throughout this talk. I think that the credibility metrics, i.e. the way in which a researcher establishes that their work has had an impact, are of just fundamental significance in explaining almost everything about academic publishing and where it is, where it's been historically, and what the opportunities for the future hold. And I actually personally believe that credibility metrics really are the fulcrum on which academic communication is going to pivot. It's something that is absolutely core to how we think about designing our product, is building metrics that incentivize the kind of behavior that we believe is good for the academic community. The product that we have on the site right now is a fairly kind of sophisticated, deep analytics platform for your own research. It shows you how many views there are for your papers, and shows you which country. I haven't got slides for every single tab, but at the top you can sort of click through tabs. There's a countries tab that shows you a big map of the world, and you can see where the traffic's coming from. You can see which search engines are driving you the most traffic. I think that the general recognition here on the part of researchers is that online really is the main channel through which your research is being consumed. And as someone trying to make a bigger impact on the world and bigger impact on the academic community, it's important to understand those channels and understand the metrics around those channels and understand what's driving the traffic. We actually, there's more than just a gratification angle here, although there is that. I mean, this is one of the most popular features. People log in every day to check these stats because, anyone who is a content creator really cares about impact. They really care about, are you speaking to an empty room, or are there people really listening? And it matters a lot. But there is a broader role than just gratification, which is what we often find academics taking screenshots of these their analytics dashboard in academia, including them with their tenure track applications or their grant applications. And the rationale behind this sort of behavior is basically that, as we all know, it's just incredibly tough and competitive environment to get academic funding these days. Both grant funding and getting jobs. I'm just astounded by, all my extremely bright friends that in the academic world who struggle to get jobs in the places they're hoping to get jobs in, and similarly, getting grants is very tough. And the reality is, you apply for a grant, and there are 200 other people with the same number of peer-reviewed publications also applying for the same grant. And you've got to find some way of standing out from the crowd, and that's where metrics like these come in. You can use these metrics to establish that your work has a substantial online impact, and it's just another string to your bow. I actually personally believe that, and this is a theme I'm coming back to, is when you look at the way in which new credibility metrics, new impact metrics are being introduced to science and scientific discourse generally, what's really driving them is the competitive spirit of researchers themselves. They're saying, here is a metric, say the number of pages and or downloads, or here's my sort of international reach. I think this reflects well on my research to some degree. I'm going to include it in my clinical application. I care about that kind of thing. And similarly, if your citation counts matter, again, you will say, here are my citation counts for Google Scholar. I care about these metrics, and that's how these metrics get introduced. So the third aspect, so you have the profile, you have the analytics around the profile, the analytics around your consumption of your research. The third thing is the newsfeed, which we call social discovery of research. The basic idea is you follow people on the site. It's like a Twitter model where you follow people, and you get a list of papers. You can also follow topics, actually. So I follow the philosophy topic and a bunch of philosophy of mind related topics. But I see all the papers uploaded to the site tagged with those research interests, and also all the papers uploaded by people I'm following. So it's a real-time feed of what's going on in your research area. It's just a good way of keeping in touch. So I'm going to talk now about our goals and ambitions and dreams for Academia.edu, how we think about some of the inefficiencies in the academic publishing system right now, and how we plan to fix them. So the first goal for academia is to introduce instant distribution into the academic discourse, academic communication world. Right now, there's an average time lag of about 12 months between submitting a paper to a journal and coming out. And if you imagine this in the context of Twitter, imagine it taking 12 months to publish a tweet. I mean, it's literally unfathomable. And it's just extraordinary. Every single aspect of the academic communication system, scientific discourse, is punctuated by these 12-month timelines. If you see a paper, want to respond to it, it's another 12 months. Conversations can take years to play out. And I think, if you look at the rest of the web, there is an instant distribution model. There are systems that have emerged to disseminate ideas very quickly to large numbers of people, and also to introduce sort of peer review elements to them. I'm going to be talking about the future of peer review as well. But removing those timelines completely is a huge goal for academia, so that for Academia.edu, so that when you publish a paper on DNA sequencing, everyone in the DNA sequencing community sees it instantly, not 12 months later. The second aspect, the second goal for academia is historically there's been this sort of single mode of publication issue in the world of research, where the paper is the coin of the realm, and if your idea can't be published in the form of a paper, it's basically worthless as far as scientific credit is concerned. It doesn't get any credits whatsoever. You can't put blog posts on your CV, nor can you put status updates, even if they're very insightful comments on papers. Another casualty of this bias towards PDFs and papers is things like data sets. It's absolutely amazing that vast quantities of huge data sets get created in the scientific world every single day, and then they languish privately on scientists' hard drive, and don't by and large get shared. And the reason for this, if you talk to scientists, well, look, you published this paper, it's backed up by a data set and this code base that you wrote to sort of mine the data set. Why don't you share the data set? I mean, your readers want it. They want to sort of get their hands dirty and roll up their sleeves and see if the conclusions of the paper really are supported by the data, and draw their own conclusions. You ask the scientists, why can we do this? This is a publicly funded asset. It's part of the canon of scientific knowledge. And they say, look, I don't get any credit for it. I can't put a data set on my resume, my CV. I just simply, there's no point in spending the week that it'll take to curate the data set and get it to a form that's presentable and understandable to a third party. We've really got to move beyond that. I think the second huge repository of unshared research information, unshared research thinking is all the thoughts and the ideas and the comments that occur to a researcher in their day-to-day work. When you read a paper, there are lots of thoughts you have, and sometimes they're extremely insightful, sometimes they're an entire refutation of the paper. And the reality is that these thoughts, broadly speaking, 99.9% of them stay private to the researcher, or maybe they share a small percentage of them with their immediate colleagues. In some cases, they just read and sort of socialize some thoughts they have about it. A very, very small percentage of those thoughts might in fact inform their own papers, but by and large, those reactions don't get shared. And that's a huge repository of sort of micro contributions that just stay private right now, and to build a system that incentivizes the sharing, so that we build a credibility metric system that is more generous and more tolerant of different forms of contributions to the canon of knowledge. Videos is another part, code base is another part. I think that scientific output needs to be a lot more heterogeneous than it has been historically. We need to move beyond a lot of PDFs. The third major goal of that, I think that the dream here is that a villager in India should have the same access to the world's scientific output as a professor at Georgetown, or Harvard, or Stanford. Right now, about 10 million people in the world have access to research papers that more or less be funded by taxpayers. And I think it's of critical importance that there are 2.5 billion people online right now, soon there will be 7 billion people. I really think magical things can happen when you expose the literature, scientific literature, to 7 billion people. I mean, I think that there are a couple of things that could happen. One is that it could be that some budding physics genius in a high school in Japan could feast themselves in their mind and develop their mind further if they have access to some of the most advanced physics thinking, which right now they just don't have access to. Secondly, I think potentially the whole population could become more scientifically literate, which I think is just a good thing generally. I think there are lots of magical things that may happen when you sort of multiply the audience for scientific literature to classify that many factors to the whole world. And the fourth thing that we want to achieve is a more robust and agile peer review process. So the way the peer review process right now works is that broadly speaking, it takes about 12 months to complete on average. And at the end of that 12-month process, you get the opinions of 2 academics. And those opinions are supposed to be broadly, and the whole point about peer review is it's supposed to surface some opinions that are broadly speaking representative of the scientific and research community about this particular paper. And the reality is 2 people are just far too small a sample size to generate an opinion or a sentiment that's representative of a large body of people. I mean, there are just so many sort of flaws in a number that small. I mean, the 2 people might be biased, they might be uninformed about the subject area, they might be in a bad mood when writing a review, you might not have cited them appropriately and they'll be sort of annoyed about that. There are all kinds of issues. I mean, the peer reviews themselves are not peer reviews, so there's not the same incentive to be rigorous. You can sort of be a bit looser and more slack in your own kind of criticism of the paper. I think it's really, and it just takes a long, long time. I think it's critical that we build a peer review system that surfaces opinions from the entire scientific community, research community, not just 2 people. And moreover, it does this in real time. The models that I see, and I think that peer review is going to be a very multi-dimensional thing. I think when you think about what is sentiment, when we ask what is the sentiment of the research community towards the paper, the reality sentiment comes in very different forms. There are very superficial kinds of sentiment, such as I read this paper, I deemed it worthy of my time to read it. There's a slightly higher level, which is recommendation. There's a slightly higher level, which is, actually engagement with a paragraph in the paper and demonstrating it can be false or in need of development. There's entire sort of paper responses. I think we need to surface all of these kinds of sentiment and socialize those pieces of sentiment in the community. I think you'll see the emergence of algorithms that, as scientific activity moves online, that have historically been a very offline thing. People print up papers, they read them in untrackable ways in their labs and their studies. I think what's happening is that this activity is moving online. Furthermore, you actually know who is sharing these papers, who is recommending them, who is reading them. And you can attach that identity as an important kind of factor in the algorithm. For instance, a recommendation for a paper from Stephen Pinker is just worth more, than a recommendation of a paper from a grad student. And I think you'll see the emergence of algorithms that demonstrate the display, the trending papers worldwide in neuroscience, as which a lot of different factors will also drive how many page views things have had, how much common discussion has been generated, who the people are that are interacting with the paper, are they senior academics or less senior, and so on. I think you're going to see peer review be much more multi-dimensional and faster. A bit like the web, really. I mean, the reality is you say, what does the web think about a piece of content? It doesn't really make sense. I mean, there are lots of different ways in which content gets evaluated, shared, and recommended on the web. There's Twitter, and Facebook, and YouTube, and so on. So the broad kind of unifying, one of the broad unifying themes here is that creditometrics are the fulcrum which scientific research is going to fit. If you want to encourage multimedia sharing, multi-system distribution, the way to do that is to develop metrics that actually incentivize that kind of thing. So if you want data sets to be shared, it's critical to have credibility metrics that actually establish the impact of the data set. They are used, they do play into the scientific community. It's important for us to surface metrics that establish that kind of impact. So that's it. Stay in touch. I always love talking about the future of research communication, and something I think about all the time in terms of the future of my own company, and I'd love to share that with you, any of you afterwards in the Q&A.
I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, which is in fact often on social media and new forms of scholarly communication. But a lot of what we've been doing so far is talking about sort of the now, right? What is the very cutting edge of what's happening? And that is a lot of the research that I do, but I'm also going to give you a little bit of sense of what I'm going to call the long now. I'm going to look back 30 years into the history of what's been happening with scholarly communication and use one particular case. But so here's the title, Then Change in the Long Now of Knowledge Infrastructure from David Rivas, Communication Culture Technology here on campus. Okay, so let me start with how many people have seen this before? This is the clock of the long now. One person. We're in California, right? So yeah, it's local. Right. So this is an actual object that exists in the world. It's the clock of the long now. It's a clock that's designed to last for 10,000 years. So it's, and in fact, if you go to, it's toured. It toured in DC about 3 years ago. There's 2 of them in the world right now. It was designed by Stuart Brand and his colleague, Stuart Brand. Some of you may recognize that name. He's a major environmental activist, but also the founder of things like The Well, one of the very first online communication venues. So Stuart Brand, in his book about the clock of the long now, says to us, it will tick once a year, it will chime on the century, and it will cuckoo every millennium. And then the mythology goes, I don't know if it's true, but that this will open up after every 10,000 years, and like this cuckoo will come out, right? So no one's ever seen the cuckoo. So he says to us, we're going back to the early excitement about clocks. They were big, they were monumental, they were something that a city would organize itself around, the clock in Prague, the clock in Venice, right? So that there was an entire community that oriented itself around these activities of this clock. And then lastly, he says to us, for 3 years, we've been working on a building, we're building this 10,000-year clock. So it took 3 years, but while they were building this thing, they were thinking about a 10,000-year span, right? So this is the idea of the long now, that as you're doing something today, you're thinking about the future, not just the immediacy of what's happening with Twitter today, what you're going to do with your cell phone tomorrow, but what are we thinking, decades, centuries down the line? So it's a thought piece, right? It's not, I mean, it exists and it will work, but it's a thought piece. It's something to provoke our thinking beyond the immediacy of today's technological change. And so he says to us also then, here's a nice little graphic that I assimilated myself, but it's his ideas, that the long term, the long now, is something that meets at the intersection of institutions, technology, and human organization. What he's saying to us then is that you don't just build a clock and it's going to run 10,000 years. That's not the way things work, right? This thing actually needs maintenance, right? So somebody down at the bottom, humans, in a kind of organization, an institution, a library perhaps, but also he points to things like monkhoods, could run this and maintain this thing and wind this thing for a 10,000-year span. It's not going to do it on its own, right? Okay, so he also says to us then, it's going to face kinds of changes over these 10,000 years, and he says to us, remain flexible to change. Okay, so I love this clock. I'm using it as an iconic image, but also want to take issue with some of the things that he says. And in particular, I'm always really frustrated by this word flexible. This is something that's tossed around very commonly to us today around, in the face of technological change, remain flexible. Well, I want to ask the question then is, what is flexibility? What does this thing mean? What does it mean when we say that something is flexible? And to answer that question, the only thing I'm going to be able to do in this talk, because I have a short amount of time, but I can give you a little taste of the kind of research that I do, is ask, what is change? What kind of change do we have to be flexible towards when you're thinking about the long term? All right? So I'm going to use a case. I'm a qualitative researcher, I'm an ethnographer principally, and also a historical researcher, archival researcher. But I'm going to use a case that comes right here from on campus. This is the multi-center AIDS cohort study. It's running out of the medical school. I have a collaboration in this project with them. It's a study of HIV-positive men that's been running for 30 years. So I'll detail it out for you. Why am I even, so I'll describe what the MAX is first. So it's a distributed organization. It's in 4 different sites. One of them is here at Georgetown at the medical school. It's a collaboration of medical doctors and scientists from many different disciplines who are all investigating the natural history of AIDS, the progression of the disease AIDS over time. It was founded in 1983. So it's been running for nearly 30 years, and it is a longitudinal study. This means that they've been following cohorts of gay men for those 30 years, right? So you take people who are HIV positive and also HIV negative, and you track them by constantly monitoring their health status, taking blood samples, and so on over long periods of time. So why do I even call this thing a knowledge infrastructure? Why is it a knowledge infrastructure? I'll give you some of the themes that in my field we often talk about these kinds of organizations in these ways. It's distance collaboration. So this relates to not just this organization, but just a lot of kinds of activities today that are occurring at a distance, that we're communicating at a distance, that we're doing our work not face-to-face. That it has people that serve, it's an infrastructure that serves kinds of people. In the same way as a library can be thought as having users, so does this infrastructure. In this case, they're medical doctors and scientists. They're from different kinds of disciplines, so that it's about interdisciplinary collaboration. How do you get the kinds of different scientists and scholars working together? It was founded in 1983, so we usually think of infrastructure as being something that is long-term, it's persistent, it sustains itself for many, many decades. So this has been running for 30 years. And lastly, it's longitudinal. Over these 30 years, they've been collecting data and specimens. And so all of the issues that, I imagine that we've got many librarians, archivists, information scientists in the room, and so these are familiar words to you. Things like data management, curation, preservation, and today building of things like metadata standards and ontologies. Right? So how do we deal with all of these are the facets that make it a kind of infrastructure. But today I just want to talk about this idea of what has changed, right? So in response to this idea of be flexible, I want to talk about what do you have to be flexible towards in an organization like this. To do that, I'm going to give you a sort of a quick potted history of this organization as it's been running over for the last 30 years. So here's Max, and I'm going to focus first on what I'm calling the socio-technical element. This is kind of a buzzword that has become less of a buzzword and more of an everyday word. Do you remember I sort of showed this diagram of Stuart Brand's work? I'm smushing together here the organization and the technology and saying these always have to be thought about together. This is a terminology then, socio-technical, that sort of helps us think about not just technologies over here and people over here, but how do these things work together? All right, so Max then was founded in 1983 on a different set of kinds of technologies that we think about today. We're still thinking about technology. We've been talking about it for the last 40 minutes now. But it was founded on the technologies of mail and phone and face-to-face. In other words, people in Chicago, so the four sites are Chicago, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, and here in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, mailed to each other proposals and ideas about how they were going to put this thing together. They called each other and faxed papers across to each other. That's the technology it was founded on. But over its history, it's had to deal with many, many kinds of changes. And we all know what those are, right? So email pops along somewhere along the story, and they have to absorb and add email to their forms of communication, content management systems. Eventually, and the web, obviously, video conferencing has sporadically been used, and I'm adding it over here in the mid-2000s, but even today, it's still only sporadically used by these scholars, and then today they're talking about social media. So the adoption of these technologies has been, I'm not saying it was adopted, rather it took many years for each one of these technologies to be pulled in, but over these 30 years, they've had to constantly pick up new technologies. It isn't just, social media comes along and, whoa, there's this new thing. No, 30 years they've been dealing with new kinds of ways of communicating. Since I've got librarians and archivists and information scientists in the room, I also want to say something about data. For the techies in the room, you'll get excited about this little element. So they started sharing data by paper. They mailed data sheets to each other. After that, it wasn't until a few more years later before they even had anything computerized, and then they were flat files, which means essentially that they were just lists of data. Eventually, they added relational databases, particularly in the late or mid-1990s, and they created a metadata standard so that they could share these data. And then today, some of their data is provided in web services. So not just the way that they talk, but the way that they share data has been on constant transition for these 30 years. Okay, so far I talked only about the socio-technical element, this fusion of technology and a social work, an organization, and social humans working together. But I want to draw your attention to other kinds of changes. In fact, this is the kind of conversation that we've largely had today. We've been talking as if the thing that's changing is the technology. Well, I'm going to say to you, it's not. There's a lot more going on, and I'm going to use this organization as an example of that. So let's jump down to this bottom layer, and I'm going to say something like science. The science itself has been changing. The things that they've been investigating over the last 30 years are not the same in how they do so. So here, I'll give you a quick potted history again of what does HIV AIDS look like over the last 30 years? So in 1981 is when we first started talking about this disease of AIDS. We didn't know what it was. It was an emerging crisis, particularly within the gay community, but also other communities. Nobody quite understood what was going on and how it was being transmitted. That's one of the reasons that MAX was founded in 1983, to find out how this AIDS disease was being transmitted and what was it. We didn't even know until 1984 that HIV is the cause of it. So no, this organization was founded before we even knew that there was this viral entity. It could have been many other things, and they were exploring many other things that could have been in 1983. In particular, things like the use of poppers was something that was considered. This is a drug that gay men use for recreational purposes, but also all kinds of other things like sexual practices in the gay community and so on were suspected. But it wasn't until 1984 that we understood that it was HIV. So think about how radical a change for an organization that is, to begin by looking, not understanding what you're looking for this, the cause of the disease, and then to have this entity appear. Well, it went on, but the changes continued for the next 30 years. So it wasn't until 1985 that there were antibody tests. We couldn't know whether someone was HIV positive or not until 1985. The first 2 years of this project, they were following 5,000 gay men across the country, but couldn't tell them whether or not they were HIV positive. They knew that there was such a thing as HIV, but they didn't know how to test for it. I'm going to jump all the way up to 1995. Until 1995, HIV/AIDS as a disease was a fatal disease. You would die within a few years of beginning to manifest symptoms. It wasn't until 1985 that we came up with what we call today the cocktail, or HAART treatment, highly effective antiretroviral treatment. And at that point, the disease changed radically. At that point, it went from people dying from AIDS to people living with HIV. It became a chronic disease. And all of a sudden, the study was focused on men who were not going to be dying within a few years, but who were going to be living for long periods of time. All right, so let me put that on this bottom scale of science. This is the phenomena itself. The object that they've been researching has been changing radically over those 30 years. What else does that mean for us? What else does this mean for this organization? Well, it started as a biological and medical study. I'm going to talk about the disciplines now. Who was involved in doing these kinds of studies? It started as a biological medical study. It was doctors who were concerned and biologists. But as the disease itself changed, the kinds of scientists who were involved also changed. I didn't talk about this, but in the late 80s, we realized that HIV causes kinds of neurological disorders as well. So they had to add neurological and psychological scientists. Once it became a chronic disease, once it was no longer fatal, once it was something you were going to have to live with, then they had to figure out, how do you live? How is it to live with a chronic disease for many, many decades at a time? And so they added social scientists who were concerned with these kinds of issues. And then over time, as aging became an issue, all of a sudden it became possible to age with HIV. Something impossible, obviously, in this era. And so they started adding doctors who care about things like blood pressure and vision loss. So what I want to say to you here is changes in what we call interdisciplinarity, which I think is a term that obfuscates the kinds of challenges that are involved in dealing with actual interdisciplinarity. Biological medical is already an astoundingly difficult interdisciplinary achievement. These are scientists and these are practitioners. Getting these people to work together is tricky. Adding a bunch of, adding a bunch of social scientists, who were like, somewhere between flaky and deep, will also present kinds of challenges in dealing with biological medical researchers. And then all these other brands of scientists. So interdisciplinarity radically changed as the story went along over those 30 years. And then last but not least, I'm going to jump up to what I call this institutional scale. No one in the field is paying attention to this in my field. We're at Georgetown, and so in fact there's a lot of people who deal with kinds of questions around policy. Policy is often the way it's phrased at Georgetown. But in infrastructure studies, science and technology studies, my field, it gets undercovered. But institutional changes were also occurring. MAX has to be refunded every 6 years. It is an infrastructure, yes, and that is going to persist and it's longitudinal, but it needs to get funded again and again every 6 years. Probably everyone in the room experiences these kinds of changes, right? Very painful. Every 6 years you have to go for grants again. Well, every 6 years for the last 30 years, they've had to re-justify why the study that they're doing is important. And each time that they do this, they have to relate it to broader issues and say, we are relevant to the world. We're still doing something that's interesting, even after we've come up and transitioned the disease to a chronic disease, and now we have treatment for it over the long term. We still have to become relevant in other ways. There's no cure, that's why we're relevant, right? So each time they have to re-justify. And then last but not least, or maybe second to last but not least, somewhere, and I put this up in the institutional realm because it was the NIH, the National Institution of Health, that sponsors them, that in the mid-1990s said to them, you must share your data. And we talked a little bit about this. It's not a recent phenomenon to have to share data. NIH has mandated this legally. If you are funded over $500,000 a year, you must have a repository and share data with people outside of this project. Huge monumental undertaking for this organization. All of a sudden, their data that they collected for 15 years and would collect for another 15 years had to be able to be shared, and it was a mess before this. People in this room probably know what mess of data looks like. And then I'll mention one last issue, leadership and program sites. So there's people involved in this project, even though I've just been putting words up here and no photographs. There are leaders, there are scientists, there are principal investigators of each site, and these people have been changing, and so leadership has been changing over the 30 years. So this is like a big sort of a chart of all the kinds of changes, and it's not even vaguely filled with all the things that I could tell you, the kinds of challenges that they've encountered over the last 30 years that go well beyond the technological kinds of changes. They've had to deal with all of these things at the same time and in overlapping manners. So I'll just conclude then. The next steps in my research is to understand, so I've told you what has changed. My next step is to understand what is flexibility. So when you hear the word be flexible though, so some of that's our take home. When you hear the words or the phrase be flexible, first ask yourself, like, what are you talking about? What is it to be flexible? But really also, so flexible relative to what? It's not just technological change that we have to deal with today. We also have to deal simultaneously with changes in the objects. And I think if we're talking about a university or a library, we're talking about the changing kinds of users, people who come to this library and what kinds of expectations they have. I don't think that they're saying, kids today are not the same entities as they were 30 years ago, right? Forms of interdisciplinarity are changing. Let's be specific here. Let's not just wrap our hands around and say interdisciplinarity is something that's happening to the university. Let's get specific about what it is to collaborate between medical scientists and social scientists versus medical scientists and biologists, for example. And then there's policy and regulatory changes occurring always at the same time as well. Thank you. So we're going to set up here?
Yeah, let's see. I'll just make a few comments and throw out a few ideas, and then I guess open it to questions for this great panel of speakers. So I guess one of these are very different talks, so let me see if I can try and tie them together at least in a small way. We have lived with a system that's been around for a long time in terms of academic scholarship, in terms of how we do research, in terms of how we evaluate that research. And some would argue that the way we evaluate that research, the way we do that research, and the way we disseminate it is old and archaic and out of date and not working anymore. And I'm sure many of you would agree with many of those statements, but on the other hand, we're still reliant on them, and there are a number of people who are interested in keeping these systems around and alive. And it does turn out that we are social animals and we respond well to incentives. And if the incentives are designed in such a way that keeps the system in place, that's probably what we're going to do. And so if you talk to a lot of junior faculty, in the face of all this beautiful technology and all these ways we can share and work with each other, and all these ways we can have all these social metrics to really understand the impact of our work, at the end of the day, our promotion is still based on publishing in a certain number of journals that are unfortunately bound to these systems where only 2 angry people read your paper. which is usually the case. If you're lucky, it's so, you know, it seems so random, it seems so inefficient, it seems so unfair. On the other hand, we have this we're living in this system, and we know, you know, as a younger person, as a junior faculty, you don't have really much power to change things. But then, you know, you see the internet, you see the potential, you see so much more that you can do. You see all these other ways in which crowdsourcing and, you know, the general public is able to evaluate different kinds of things, and it could be someone singing on YouTube and they get a lot of likes and then they end up being Justin Bieber or something like that. You know, and hope that maybe this is a great model for our papers. Maybe I can be Justin Bieber of academia. But on the other hand, is that the right, you know, is that also the best system? So we got to think about, you know, is a popular metric the right metric? So that's one question. I think the other question really that, you know, this is something we were talking about at Creative Commons like 10 years ago, talking about publishing and academia and open licensing and things like open access and all these things, was that who actually holds the levers right now? And it's the funders. We just talked about that. NIH can require people who get large grants to make those things, to make all that data public. It's the universities. So who within the university is willing to be a leader and say, you know, your tenure isn't just based on getting published by 2 angry people. Your research is actually, your tenure is actually based on some of these broader metrics. Who actually is going to take the time to think of how this new system would work to make it more robust? Because as we know, incentive systems are incredibly hard to create, and even when you have, you know, the wisdom of the crowds and things like that, these things can also be gamed. And so how do you actually design a system that's robust and that's meaningful and isn't just based on things that can be gamed? And then how do you actually, you know, take the initiative to change a system when so many people have, you know, have their whole careers invested in the way we've been measuring and evaluating research? How do you actually bring about that change and get people to think about a new way of doing things? And maybe, you know, it seems like some fields may be better at doing this than others. So we talked about interdisciplinary issues. I do believe some fields are a little bit more on the cutting edge of, you know, using technology to disseminate research, using peer review online. So I think the physicists are actually kind of ahead of the curve on this. How certain disciplines are ahead and how other disciplines are behind, but really, at least in my view, a lot of what has to change has to come from the leadership. So it has to come from leaders in the university who are deciding on tenure. It has to come from the journals themselves. So recently in my field, some of the journals are not only requiring you submit your paper, but that now you're required to submit your data also. That's, I think, more in line for academic integrity, but as a side effect could be valuable in increasing collaboration. Again, with the data, you know, as a researcher, how do you incentivize a researcher to release their data when they've invested so much time in that and they can actually use that for multiple papers? To me, everything comes down to the incentive systems. How do you organize an incentive system that actually works with today's technology? And how can, you know, technology is, I mean, I do think that some people feel a little behind the curve because we are, you know, not transitioning fast enough. So how can you kind of make people feel a little pressured by feeling a little out of date? You know, maybe there's some kind of social pressure that can be used to push people forward a little bit. And then finally, the last comment is, you know, how can the university, so one of the projects that I worked on was this idea called AccuWiki. It was a way to get around some of the copyright issues, since there's no copyright in an idea. There's only copyright in the expression of an idea. And the university, you know, does a lot in terms of how can the university continue to at least communicate the key components of the research findings of the academics in a way that's, you know, human readable, but also it's not violating anyone's copyright. You can basically summarize a paper put a post on Facebook, put a post on Twitter. But how can there be additional incentives? We already have a department working, very diligently to get this stuff out there, but having the researchers themselves write summaries of their own papers and putting them out there so that people can actually access this. How can we actually increase again, the velocity of information being disseminated? So those are just my broad thoughts. And there are a lot of questions and topics in there, so I invite the audience and the panel to continue the discussion. So how about we just open it up to questions and comments? Yes.
I like your challenge of saying that the whole model is required flexibility. That means that there's something of integrity that you have to keep. And in the models that you guys are all working in, what do you think is that integrity that has to be kept while other things fall away?
Yeah, I can answer that, especially in the case, and then I can try to generalize from that. So sometimes I presented this, and then someone asks me, so why is this even the same thing? Why is Max the same thing over these 30 years? The thing that they've been doing for the last 30 years consistently is taking those blood samples from those men and archiving them, and not just blood samples, other things. I don't want to be too graphic, but there's a lot of other things that they have to keep track of. And they freeze those blood samples and so on. And what that allows them to do then is, they start collecting blood in 1983, but HIV isn't known until 1984. Then you can retest all the blood and find out, when did someone seroconvert and so on. And they've been doing that consistently for 30 years. I call that the kernel. It's the thing that you have to keep doing in order to make all these changes viable. And so I don't, in other kinds of scientific organizations I've studied, like scientists who study rivers for 30 years, collecting the water of the river for 30 years and preserving it so that you can test it in different ways later. Now, what else, how much more can we generalize from that? I don't know. What else, what's the core that has to remain? It's a good question.
In the concept of scholarly communication.
I'm happy to speak to it from the perspective of Academia.edu. I think our core thing that runs through our philosophy of the site and the future of the site is about communication, just accelerating communication amongst researchers around the world and enriching communication by making it more multidimensional, not just via PDFs, but via a richer range of contributions. That's really, we have this belief that a species, a community that communicates more will accelerate faster. Just look at the kind of difference in where the world is now versus where it was 100 years ago. That delta is just quite unbelievable. And if you compare it with previous centuries, the difference in progress is vastly bigger. And there are lots of different explanations for why we've grown so much faster in the last 100 years than previous centuries. There are obviously more people now, more innovators and more creators, but there's also just a much more networked world, more communication going on with telephones, radio, TV, and lately the internet. And we just believe very strongly that a more community that communicates more will think of ideas more quickly.
I would say from my perspective at the university, we've for decades, centuries, been communicating news about what our students and faculty are doing about new policies and and whether it was picking up the phone and calling someone or faxing a reporter. Now we just put it out and so many thousands more people can see what's happening here at Georgetown. So we're much closer and the mechanism has changed, but our purpose of sharing the truth and the facts about the university is the same. We just have to be even more responsive because people learn it's two-way so many of these forms of communication.
Can I play a counterpoint? And actually, I would be interested to see how you respond. So there is an unofficial movement amongst some scholars called slow science these days. There's also words like slow information.
Slower.
Slower, right. And so the idea there being that there's an accelerating pace of us as faculty having to publish more and more, and frankly that no one can read anything. I just learned, so I did my postdoc at the Information School in Michigan, and they're like the masters of metrification, right? Like they make metrics for these kinds of things. One of them that I learned was the smallest publishable unit. Have anyone heard this one? So this is don't publish everything that you've researched, don't publish all your findings in one thing. make it the smallest amount that you can still get it published, so that you can have another paper and another paper and another paper, right? And we all have to have lots of papers to get tenure and so on. It's a horrific idea. You're not synthesizing, then you're not presenting a big picture. But so I wonder if this idea of faster, faster, faster is not quality and synthesis and overviews. It's going to lead to piecemeal visions and a sort of frantic quality amongst professors to get more out but less quality.
Can you get a whole paper in a Twitter post?
I'd like to pick up on both what Jennifer said and what David just said, because I think integrity also equates with quality. And that's the one thing I'm not sure you can assure in any of these social media sites. One of the questions I would have asked of Rachel is, what site then is definitive for the university if you want to know something that you have to rely on? Is it the Facebook account? Is it the website? Is it this and that? One thing I would ask of Richard is how posting and augmenting your own profile works in a quality control mechanism. I mean, anybody can post, really, to any place. And this is in no way meaning to diminish Academia.edu, but then if it's not too angry critics, but 4,000, what makes that a whole lot better if you can't maintain the quality control of those 4,000? And a question I would pose for David is, how do you look at the spectrum of publishing across these kinds of disciplines, especially when you talk about incremental pieces that go together, which may work in the social sciences, it may work in the scientific community, but I don't think it works in humanities disciplines when still, whether it be a digital version or a print version, the object of metric for a scholar is still a scholarly monograph. And you can't just take pieces, chapters of your newly published dissertation and say, this is the smallest incremental unit I can publish to get tenure. I mean, it's a whole different world. I am very concerned. I actually see the greater role than ever for libraries in this kind of world to curate data, manage it, preserve it for perpetuity. It's especially when you look at David's example of the continuum of that sort of thing. But I also see that we have to be flexible because the kinds of things that we may be curating, I'm going off on a rant, I'm sorry, are quite different than what we've done before. But I think the issue of integrity, the maintenance of the information, the quality of the information, the peer review process that can happen informally are huge issues for all of us to consider. And there you are.
I'll speak to that because I think about quality a lot. And there's sort of broader question here that you raised, which is how do you distinguish between popularity and impact?
Which Neeru just brought up, right?
And I think one really, I find when thinking about these issues, it's really, really critical to look at how other systems will solve quality control issues. And the first place I always go in terms of what will give me a good sort of grip on the future of scientific communication, the first place I go is just the web at large. Like, how does Google solve the information overload problem which you brought up? Like, there's just so much stuff on the web. How do you decide what to read? And I think that let's take Google. So one of the sort of absolutely critical things that Google does that for instance makes it immune to the sort of like the 4,000 likes from one, who's liking the YouTube videos and the 4,000 anonymous peer reviewers, why are they better than 2? One of the things that distinguished Google from previous search engines and the whole idea of PageRank was that it took account of the identity of the inbound linkers. So for instance, instead of just saying, oh, how many people have linked to this website? It says, well, how important are the sites that link to this website? And it's absolutely critical to you. So the algorithm became recursive in that way, that it took account not just of the number of links, but how important they were, as judged by the number of links coming to them. So it was a very recursive algorithm. And it was very interesting, actually. I think it contains some lessons for us in the future. At the time, Larry Page, who invented this new quality control metric to work at scale, it was poo-pooed by his advisor, Terry Weinegard at Stanford, who thought that Larry Page basically had this insight when he was going to bed one night. He said, gosh, if I I data mine the link structure of the web, if I just took the links and which links link to each other, and then just sort of ran this algorithm on top of that link structure and threw everything else away, all the photos and all the content, just took the link structure, wouldn't that be pretty cool? And couldn't you find to extract some sentiment from that, from the link structure of the web, which is a bizarre place if you look for sentiment. I mean, how can a link represent anything very powerful? It turns out links multiplied, by a few trillion do deliver sentiment and the power of the PageRank algorithm. So I think that one thing that's absolutely critical when one thinks about the future of peer review and quality control and how to manage information overload in this age of increasing amount of information, it's going to get more if anything. If you get the multimedia dreams about data sets, code, comment sharing, it's only going to get bigger. I think an absolutely critical thing is to build a recursive aspect to these peer review algorithms, so that when you look at how many recommendations a paper has, the algorithm that kind of ranks those recommendations also takes into account who's recommending the papers and how prestigious they are. I mean, that's a more or less a generalization of how peer review works anyway. I mean, for instance, when the reason Nature is considered a prestigious journal is that it has prestigious peer reviewers. And when they give a thumbs up, when two people from Nature give a thumbs up on the paper, readers know that two prestigious, two senior scientists gave it a thumbs up. So there's an implicit degree of recursiveness already in the extremely old-fashioned peer review system. It's not very recursive, it doesn't go that far back beyond two reviewers, it's also very small, it takes a long time. But the core concepts are there, and actually comes back to the first question of what will stick around. And I think, the seniority of peer reviewers will be something that sticks around, is something critical to quality control. Communication will stick around, and I think these things, the important thing is to provide an incentive system where the whole scientific community is incentivized to engage with the literature and share their opinions. And so that someone really can see not just that two people, anonymous people who I don't know, but presumably they're impressive because they're picked by Nature, two people gave this thumbs up. What about 4,000 people? I know who they are, and I know how the world of science ranks their own opinions, and I trust that ranking. So that's I think that there are some things about the current peer review system that will be kernels of the future of it.
Could I ask a question just about the basics of the peer review that you're envisioning here? If you look at publication or distribution as kind of the 0 day, are you looking at the future of peer review as some of that happening in a smaller distribution ahead of that main distribution, or are you just looking at it as a response tail to your main distribution?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Are you looking at peer review as something that still happens ahead of main
pre
distribution?
and post. Sorry, yeah. Okay. So am I thinking about pre-publication peer review or post-publication?
It becomes a peer preview rather than peer review.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that is a staple of how academic publishing works right now is that obviously peer review happens pre-publication, and it's a sort of these two people act as gatekeepers for what the scientific community should be allowed to read. And I think that we've got to get away from that concept. I think if you look at the broader web and how research gets disseminated, there isn't actually a distinction between distribution and peer review on the web. If you look at how distribution works on Twitter and Facebook, I mean, there are basically two main discovery engines for content, two main distribution engines for content for the web at large. One is search engines, and the other one is social networks. And if you look at the way social networks distribute and peer review content, the distribution of content is actually the same event on the network as the peer reviewing. So for instance, when you retweet a link, you are distributing it to your followers, but you're also giving it a thumbs up. And the same goes for sharing a link on Facebook. So these actions of distribution and peer review, given that they're kind of relying on the kind of incentives of users to share interesting content with their friends or followers, they merge these two concepts, the distribution and peer review. And the same goes for for Google. That's also an engine that fundamentally distribution is driven by the same thing as peer review, which is the more inbound links you have from prestigious websites, which is the peer review angle, the more distribution you'll get because of how you appear in the search results. So I think that that's how I see it emerge. I think that that's how to achieve instant distribution, but at the same time and not be overwhelmed, by information overload.
So I have a mechanical question. Does Academia.edu host research, or does it just act as like a Facebook for researchers? Is it a publishing venue as well?
Oh, I see. No, it's not really a publishing venue. I mean, it's not, not in the traditional terms of publishing.
Because I'm curious, we
It's not a
talked
journal.
around the academic publishing model, but we haven't really talked directly to it, and we haven't talked a lot about open access journals and online publishing yet. So how does that fit in with the models that you're discussing? Because we talk about resistance at all different levels of academia, and I mean there's a lot of resistance, I think, to open source publishing. So how does that fit in with the models?
I know. I can talk to that. I mean, open access publishing, basically, quick summary. I mean, historically, the readers have had to pay for the cost of the journals, and it's been subscription based. And now you have these author-pays models where the author, fronts sort of $2,000 or something to the journal, and then it's free to access the readers. I think it's a sort of broadly, it's a step in the right direction. I think that it still has long peer review cycles. It's still one-dimensional in terms of the format of publication, just papers and so on. But I think it's, broadly speaking, a step in the right direction. I don't think it's radical enough. And then more broadly, I don't think the journal is going to be around for that much longer. I don't see a future where the journal is the central node of research sharing for much longer. And I think if you look at the broader web, it's the user, it's the individual. I think the lesson of the social media revolution in the last 5-6 years is that it's the individual that's the key node of distribution and peer review on the web. That is how information gets distributed. It's not sort of formal media outlets that mediate the relationship between the content creator and the audience. It's the content creator directly engaging with the audience. It's the audience then sharing the content they become content creators by sharing. They're implicitly creating content by sharing. That's how I see the future of research working out, is that the academics will engage directly with their audiences. Journals will gradually disappear. I think that what will take their place is not just, obviously they have been the credibility metric historically. How many journals can you put in your resume has been the thing to go for when you're applying for a grant or a tenure track job. I think what that will be replaced by is a family of credibility metrics. And I think there's that family of credibility metrics, whether they're inbound citation counts or views and downloads, or a lot of other metrics that are going to emerge as scientific activity moves online. I think this family will sort of exist alongside the traditional journal title credibility metric for some time. And then I think what you'll find is gradually the second and third tier journals will be the first to go. I think academics will say, they'll see that the increasing amount of their impact is being measured by different and new credibility metrics. And they'll say, well, in fact, the costs of publishing in the journal system are now just too high. And those costs are basically two. One is that it takes a long time to get it out there, so you have to put up with a 12-month timeline, and no one reading your stuff for 12 months. It's a huge cost if you're a content creator. Two, the fact that you have to hand over copyright in the old-fashioned system or hand over $2,000 in the new author-pay system, again, a huge cost. I think what you'll see is scientists saying, enough of my credibility is now coming from new sources. And in the physics world, physicists are generally more proud about their inbound citation counts than they are about their list of journal titles. So you've already seen a new citation, a new credibility metric eclipse an old one. So there are a lot of naysayers out there who think that it's very hard to drive change in academic publishing. They think that they'll never change it. They'll never change this monopoly that journal titles have on the credibility metric system. I don't think that's true. I think you can already see this system changing. You can see in certain situations where new credibility metrics are going to only emerge in the last 10 years, have already eclipsed the old one. And I think, lastly, Nature and Science will be the last ones to go, but I think that, ultimately, when you do build a system where the whole scientific community is actively peer reviewing content in real time, I think it'll be seen as very perverse and unnecessary to submit a paper to Nature just to get the opinions of 2 people 12 months later. I think it'll just be seen as insane. Why would you do that? I mean, the ultimate brand value of Nature is purely encapsulated in the fact that they elect 2 famous scientists to peer review your paper. But I think there'll be a system where you can get those 2 famous, or 4,000 famous scientists, to peer review a paper more quickly. And it'll just seem perverse to wait 12 months for an imprimatur from Nature. That's kind of how I see the gradual demise of the journal system. It'll be taken over by a much faster, much more engaged network of academic sharing opinions.
So before this revolution comes, do you think open access journals might be an intermediary step? Because I think it's going to make, I mean, I'm all for it, but I think that's going to make a lot of people anxious to completely dissolve these small systems through which we regulate research.
By the way, I don't think they'll be dissolved in a sort of scary. One thing I wanted to pick up something you said earlier was that I don't actually think the funding agencies are the institution, by the way, here with the biggest leverage. They are not going to be driving this change. Funding agencies, despite their mandates, have very little power over academics. Like most scientists don't comply with the data sharing mandates, nor do they comply with the publication mandates, the sharing your paper after 12 months. They just don't comply. And I think the real power here is the community. The scientists, I speak to the NIH quite a lot, and other policymakers in the White House and the UK government about, I want to get them to do more. And they drag their heels because they're very conservative. And also they know that the reality is no matter how many sticks they bring out of their bag to whack scientific community into changing, their scientific community doesn't change unless you provide carrots. Carrot is the way to do it. And I think, the journal system's not going to go away because someone just sort of pulls the rug under its feet or anything, and suddenly everyone's left without a system that works. I think it's going to change. It's going to disappear because the community wants it to disappear, because they're presented with new tools that they actually prefer, and they gradually start voting with their feet and saying, look, I don't need to publish in this third-tier journal. There's no one saying we're not going to fund you, we're not going to pay these author-pays fees. The funding will be around. I mean, scientific discourse is important enough that Congress will continue funding the $8 billion a year that it costs to support the journal system. I think what will lead to its demise is the academic community finding better tools and voting with their feet. Whether open access publishing or author-pays publishing will be a real intermediary, I don't think it will be. I think you're seeing change at such a rapid pace right now that in the technologies that scientists and academics are using, that it's just going to be a very small blip. I see a future where it just doesn't cost any money whatsoever to share research. I mean, it's just a piece of digital content. And right now, journals charge effectively $4,000 per paper to distribute around the world. It's just unbelievable. I mean, if you look at how much it's just a piece of digital content. They're not paying for the peer reviews. They're just paying a few secretaries to chase up peer reviewers and badger them until they get their peer reviews. And they pay a website to host the PDF. And that's fundamentally what a journal's become. And in terms of their day-to-day work. I think that you'll see a world where the economics around scientific publishing have changed dramatically from a system where it's extraordinarily expensive to disseminate digital content to a system where, if you look at Facebook, Twitter, WordPress, the web as a whole, they don't these sites don't charge the participants in the information exchange to share material. The readers don't pay and the authors don't pay by and large. These sites do monetize, because when you have eyeballs and when you have data and when you can do highly targeted campaigns, Google makes tons of money. And so do these other sites. And I think that there's actually a very rich future for how scientific discourse will be monetized. It just won't be through fees on the scientists themselves. I think it'll be through
I had a question about data presentation in the idea of the future. And so I think a lot of what Rachel does is talking about how there's this research that gets put together, and she puts that research into a more understandable for kind of a lay audience group, and then then to be able to get other people interested. And so if with these groups where we're kind of talking about cutting out the middle person, so just going straight from academic to audience. And some academics, unfortunately, do have a hard time communicating these ideas in a little bit more understandable of a manner. Sometimes it's just as simple as like copy editing or the presentation of how the words get laid out on a page. Lots of pedagogy has showed that very important how data is presented for people to be able to understand it. And so if we're kind of taking away those functions and just going straight to consumer, I guess I see that being very complicated by the other end of what you guys have been talking about, or not you guys, I know there have been lots of different views expressed, sorry, but how when we're talking about getting open access, reaching out to people who don't have these library subscriptions, I think you mentioned, it would be great to give everyone a great science background, and so if they don't have that yet, how does that happen? Is it that we have people like Rachel who kind of pop out over all universities and research organizations. I know a lot of think tanks, that's what some people's primary job is to create infographics that make research more easy to understand. And I guess I'm just kind of curious how, with this movement, we would kind of keep presenting data in a tangible way that would, reach this audience that you guys are looking for.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. And I think that, by and large, journals now don't play a huge role in data presentation. I think there was a time when papers were split in a manuscript and they played quite a big role in formatting. But I think if you look at the way it's happens these days is, you have to do all the work yourself in formatting your paper according to the house style. And the input that comes back is, there obviously is the peer review aspect that comes back, but there's certainly not much hand-holding as far as, here is a more intuitive way of presenting the data. It may come from the peer reviewers, which is all well and good, and that's the sort of thing that we've preserved and expanded upon in a large peer review system. But I don't think the journals themselves play a very big role in explaining how to present data. I think it's up to the scientists and the academics to say yes, and then the peer reviewers to figure that out.
I would also be the first to say that not every piece of research is news or needs to be shared with everyone, and these journals are very much for other peers. If you're publishing in physics, you're expecting other physicists to look at your research and use that in their work. So social media offers this opportunity to really narrow down the community that you're with. So as a faculty member in the program, building a community that has a common interest in sharing the same types of research is much richer than the university putting something out to such a broad audience that we have 12-year-olds looking at our site and people all over, they don't have a physics background. And so we try to show the diversity and the depth of what's happening here, but we can't do everything. And as I just thought about some of the research that comes out, we work with PLOS ONE and Nature, and we'll try to link back to those journal sites and get people access when they can, but the researcher interprets the data. The reporter interprets the data. The reader of that reporter's report interprets the data, and it's the same as storytelling has always been, but everyone takes their own perspective. The reporter that's covering from health on a biomedical research is going to focus on human impact, and a business reporter is going to look at the financial impact and look at its research went through. So there's just such a diversity of opinions and how the information is shared and interpreted that gets to that integrity and quality question. It's up to the researcher to be available to comment as more and more people start to interpret their data.
Sorry, if I can just ask, to me it seems very clear that traditional publishing and some of the more modern models you describe are not necessarily different animals in the sense that traditional publishing peer review represents the social network of the editor and his assistants and so on, whereas these other models are social networks that are still networks, although perhaps much more informal. So to me it appears that the difference in the standard of the way of widespread adoption of an alternative is really the institutional incentives, as Neeru pointed out. The tenure process is still very much linked to particular journal titles that carry prestige in a particular field. I'm wondering, and this is a question perhaps for David and for Rachel in particular, how does the university try to promote the use of social media for sharing scientific data? Do we at all, and on a departmental level, how do you see them? I would think that communication, culture and technology particularly would be a department where you're thinking about these things very much more deeply than some of the more traditional humanities.
I'll say from my office, we're dealing broadly with the law center, the medical center, everything that's happening. And so we have less depth than the communication, culture, and technology when they're on social media, Facebook and Twitter, sharing research from other peers about the area that they study. And you see that with the Public Policy Institute and others who go into more depth and more targeted to their group than the university as a whole would.
So, CCT is very interdisciplinary. I don't think we have one person from comm who's trained as a communication person, one in the entire faculty. The rest of us are something else, right? So I'm a sociologist, and we have linguists, we have economists, we have all the breeds. which of course has forced that program in particular to have a very Catholic view towards evaluation of tenure and so on. But that also means that no one quite knows how to evaluate everyone else's work. And so one of the tools that have emerged, well, more and more tools are emerging around metricization. And so the kinds of tools that we're hearing about in everything from impact factor of the journal that you're getting into to things like, well, what's Google's new score? It's called the H score that they're now promoting as well. All of these metrics play more and more of a role because since we're not operating in the same communities, we keep looking to objective or automated measures rather than what used to be the standard, which is ask the peers of the people in your own community. So this shift is occurring right around me in very strange ways. We are a very qualitatively oriented program. There's many quantitative scholars as well, but we're cultural communication technology. We have a range of interests that go well into culture and so on, and what we see is a numerization of evaluation that's increasingly occurring as it becomes interdisciplinary. I imagine that is going to spread as well.
Yeah, I definitely want to second that. I mean, that's exactly my experience at Oxford. I was on a lot of hiring committees from 2003 to 2011, actually, during which I was a fellow also. And it was fascinating to me. I mean, one is it's extraordinarily difficult being on a hiring committee because you've got sort of 60 applicants, and they're often in different fields, and even when they're in their own field, it's just very hard to make very fine discriminations that can stand up to scrutiny when you have to defend it to 60 other people, say in the faculty or the college in our case. And there was a real hunger for more objective, seemingly objective measures, just ways, additional data points that might make the decisions a little bit easier. The data point that I saw being adopted was the inbound citation count. So people will go on Google Scholar and they say how many inbound citations does this person have for that work, and how many inbound citations. And you'd see people saying, well, this person only has 30 citations for his first few papers, and this lady has 60. What could account for that? Maybe she's in a different field, or maybe she's just better, or people would start to basically play with the metrics. And I do think that it's definitely a case of candidate emptor when you look at this trend towards metricization. You have to know the metrics and the pros and cons of the metric that you're using. You have to know how they can be gamed and how they vary between fields. Citations certainly can be gamed, and the main gaming technology for citations is the defensive citation practice, where you cite every single possible person who might conceivably peer review your paper. Hope they don't frustrate them. So those citations are not real citations; they're fake ones, but they're done defensively, and maybe quite a large number of them. So it's important to sort of understand any metric, whether it's given that that's a way of gaming the peer review process. It turns out the journal title as a credibility metric is also being gamed, because you can raise your chances for getting into a journal by defensively citing the right people. So every single metric is gamed. Google PageRank is gamed by web spam farms that exist in Korea and China and all over the place. And Google has a whole web spam team designed to figure out how their metrics are being gamed. Whenever there are incentives that are gamed, you definitely have to be on top of the metric and understand, what is its true signal.
I think my office also has lots of questions. Part of the challenge is just knowing that the research is out there. We'll comb through people's faculty profiles online and try to see what they're working on, but it doesn't always come to us. We work really hard to have relationships with all of the faculty and chairs. But it's a challenge just to know what's happening. There's a few people that really like to share their work that are out there all the time, and there are tons of people doing great work that we just don't know about. With a small staff, it's hard to know, but I encourage anyone to send information our way.
I just want to make a comment about the ways in which different fields might go digital, open access, and otherwise. So usually, you already mentioned the particle physics case. Particle physics was ahead of the curve by many decades even, with their development of a preprint server called Archive. which they started putting their publications there before they were even peer-reviewed, and they were peer-reviewed often by their own colleagues. And that was very possible within that community because particle physicists is a relatively small community of people who know each other quite well, only thousands of them, which is relatively small. It was a very publicized model. It was considered a great sort of achievement, possible way for the future to go. Medicine looked into it and tried to create their own model, which was very similar. Eventually led to PubMed, but in between many other things that failed. The reason why they failed is because there's different kinds of implications for medical research than for something like particle physics, right? It's applied, it has human consequences. You can't just pump out research that hasn't been peer-reviewed because it will have effects on what drugs people are taking or so on, right? So different spheres of the academy are going to have different kinds of paces at which they can make their data public, at which they can make their research reviewed in different ways. There are sort of good reasons as well for not always just making everything publicly available.
Comment about copyright, which is of deep interest to me as a publisher. Copyright is often characterized as the enemy within the academy, and I just want to make the point that copyright is not monolithic. Copyright is a bundle of rights, and I cringe when I hear authors, scholars claiming that they want to hold on to their copyright, because I want to ask, well, what parts of copyright do you want to hold on to? Because in some cases, authors should hold on to parts of the copyright. I think in other cases, it makes more sense for publishers to hold on to parts of the copyright for translation purposes, for instance, talking about monographs. It's simpler, I think, for publishers to handle that part of the business than for scholars themselves. But I just want to mention that, and Neeru, to your point about incentives, and we've heard about carrots and incentives a little bit, publishers can be incentivized to give up copyright, or at least parts of copyright. And so I would encourage all of you, whether you're scholars here at Georgetown or elsewhere, work with publishers. Tell publishers, I'm not comfortable giving you the entire bundle of copyright for my work, whether it's a journal article or a monograph. You can make a case, you can incentivize the publisher to let go of certain parts of copyright. And I'll give you a quick example and then I'll stop. A couple of years ago, some contributors to a journal that we publish in ethics said, I really want to hold on to parts of my copyright. I want to be able to post my essays on my departmental website. I want to be able to post my essays on my own website. And I think these contributors were saying that would really help with the visibility of your press and of the journal. We talked about it for 5 minutes at the press and said, absolutely right. So anyone who contributes to this journal that we publish in ethics, they are free to put the essay on their website, departmental website, their home website, etc. And that was an incentive we had to try to give the press and the journal more visibility. So I just want to encourage everyone, copyright is not monolithic. There are parts of copyright, it's a bundle of copyrights. Work with the things that you want to hold on to and negotiate. Don't be afraid to negotiate with publishers, whether journal articles or monographs.
I should just like to jump in there very quick and add that we do lend some institutional support to faculty publishing their papers through our institutional repositories. So if you do have the rights, if you retain rights, if you publish in an open access journal, you have the option, the possibility to deposit your papers in the repository where they will be open to the world, they're indexed by Google, easily to be found. You can link to them from whatever websites you want to create, and they're curated for the foreseeable future as well. So I just wanted to make you aware that that facility does exist.
Yep.
That's one question about the lawn now. Then, if we were to do a study of the impact of what's going on now, currently, over 1,000 years or something, we predict paradigm shifts more quickly. People would accept global warming before George W. Bush. Clovis wouldn't be the icon that it was for 150 years in archaeology. Something like that. We would expect these impacts in different sciences. I'm just guessing. What would you guess? If things are really accelerating, Is that kind of shift accelerating too? I'm just using the word paradigm shift colloquially.
Is that directed to me?
10,000 years. I think we talked about the now, but we didn't talk about the 10,000 years yet.
Right.
And I think you should have an opportunity to expand on the.
In my research, I've made about 30 years. But I'll tell you a story about why even I did that. So for my dissertation, I was an ethnographer and studied something called cyber infrastructure, which is sort of the buzzword for the building of information technologies for the sciences in a systematic fashion in the US today. So I was with them for 3 years as an ethnographer. A geosciences project was called GEON. It was about data sharing for the earth sciences. A year after I graduated, it ended. So I got defunded, and they just spread in all directions. And so what I began asking, and this happened to many of these kinds of cyber infrastructure projects in a short time. Many of them couldn't find funding again. Many of the participants got discouraged. Many of the technological projects to share data failed because it's actually incredibly difficult to share data and annotate it properly. And so I started looking backwards in time to ask the question of, well, how have other people dealt with these kinds of issues? So really, I'm actually an ethnographer. I really just like to watch people live. But I started realizing that I need to ask questions about the long history of these organizations. And maybe next, after I'm done these kinds of projects, I'll turn to understanding what have been the research trajectories of entire fields over long periods of time to be able to answer that kind of question that I can't right now.
I have a quick question for Rachel. I'm curious, you've talked a lot about the idea of telling a story and this kind of idea of visual storytelling. Can you give us some examples of peer institutions that you look at and that you think are leading the way?
Sure. I think we, as a group, have looked at Vanderbilt and Syracuse and Marquette. Sometimes we look at other Jesuit schools that we compare ourselves to, and then just other Ivies like Penn and Harvard, and see what they're doing. Stanford has a really robust social media program as well, and they are a big university covering a lot of areas, and so you'll see how they break it down into different departments and programs as well.
Right, I think with that, we come to the end of our session. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our presenters.